Welcome to the Dairy Farmers Digest, a podcast dedicated to all things dairy farming. Each episode, we will talk to industry leaders who share their insights and experiences into the dairy business. I'm your host, Keith Schweitzer, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the DFD. We got a cold January morning here, and I'm super excited to have Dr. Mike Steele from the University of Guelph on this morning. So maybe, Mike, you want to say hi and let us know maybe a little bit of your history for the people that don't know you out there.
Sure, Keith. Nice to be here on a very cold January morning. This is my second time on your podcast.
Yeah, I know
thanks
you
a lot
were.
for the next invitation. I feel like, I get a stamp of approval if I'm on the second time. So thanks, Keith. That makes me feel really nice about myself.
Oh, you're
Builds
welcome,
my
Mike.
confidence. A brief history about myself. I can do that in a couple minutes. I grew up on a dairy farm in Oxford County. I've loved dairy farming and dairy cattle. I thought I wanted to become a geneticist when I was younger because I started breeding cattle, and then I fell in love with biology at the University of Guelph. I did think about dairy farming, but I ended up doing a master's degree and ended up working in industry in China and Canada. And I came back to do my PhD at the University of Guelph, where I studied ruminal acidosis. And that was under the supervision of Dr. Brian McBride, who's now retired, but a huge mentor in my career. Basically, after that, I worked in industry and I worked for Trow Nutrition and Research and Technology Applications. And then I started working with students during that time, and I quickly realized I think it's a better fit for me to work in academia. So I started applying for a job in Canada and US, and I was lucky enough to land a job at the University of Alberta, where I started my academic career about 11 years ago. And I spent 4 years there. I've been here thereafter at the University of Guelph, having a great time. I'm studying predominantly calves at this moment. I started to do some more transition cow research. Dairy beef is a huge area of research in our lab right now. But that's a brief history of my professional career and how it's evolved. And it's been a lot of fun kind of basing in myself around Ontario.
With your job now, like you're a professor in the Department of Animal Bioscience, but like how much teaching versus research are you doing? Or are you doing any extension?
Yeah, so in Canada, we don't really have extension appointments, but we call it service, but it's very small. It's service within the university, but also some extension is something, that we like to do. I personally like extension because all my research ideas are coming from those interactions with farmers and producers. I want to make sure my research is high impact. So I go out of my way to speak to as many producers in Ontario, Canada, around the world to get more ideas about how I can focus my research program to have the largest impact. But yeah, I do a lot of teaching. I'm currently a grad coordinator for our department in the Department of Animal Biosciences at the University of Guelph. We have 180 grad students, so we have a lot on the go there. I also have a very active undergrad and graduate student teaching program. I teach several courses, and I also have a very active research program. So it's about 20% service, Keith, 40% teaching, and 40% research. But to be honest, it's 40% service, 80% teaching, and 80% research. That's the way we typically run it, if that makes any
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. Well, I know a big teaching is a big part of it. And I imagine when you're doing your research, it's a lot of dealing with the post grad or like the people that just finished their undergrad and are doing their masters and PhDs on projects with you.
Yeah, so I have an active lab full of about right now 6 PhDs and 3 MScs, and I like to keep it, a larger lab because I want my students to work together. Because when they start to do research in private industry or in academia in the future, they're going to have to work with other people, and collaboration is so important right now when you do research. So that's why, by design, I have a larger lab. Plus, I like to do a lot too. So
Yeah.
I,
Well, that's a perfect segue. Like I know a lot of your research in the past has been on colostrum and transition calves, especially. Like, is there I know you've been on the speaking tour or circuit lately talking about increasing the amount of colostrum. Like I know a couple years ago we were, I'd have to think about the numbers, but we were talking about how many units, like 100 units IgG per calf or something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah, I think like traditionally, like some of the first papers that were early 2000s and even in the 90s, they were talking about 100 grams of IgG being delivered to a calf. And this has changed to 150. Now we're talking 200. But I think, and I like to think about things as massive IgG delivered to the calf. So the grams of IgG delivered to this calf. And I think it should be well over 200. I'm not saying to increase the volume though. Okay. I'm
Okay.
saying to increase like the quality of this colostrum that you're feeding so you can make sure that a calf, I would go up to 300 grams of IgG. You can even go further as well. It really depends on the quality of your colostrum, but also like providing an adequate volume. I don't have a problem with feeding 10% of birth body weight, even at the first feeding in the first hour of life or first hour or two of life.
Oh,
I think
really?
that's really important. Yeah, I think going to 3 to 4 liters in that first meal is also something that you should be considering and a little bit hesitant to increasing the volume like that. That's why I'm saying I think it's a better approach to increase the concentration of IgG and make sure you have really high quality colostrum and you're delivering a lot of IgG per unit volume to these calves. And also
And
providing a second meal too is really important because the gut is still open. The calf can absorb these immunoglobulins, even if that second meal, let's say at 12 hours of life, the
mhm.
gut's still open and you might as well take advantage of that and raise the amount of IgG that this calf can uptake from the gut and improve its health.
And what are you seeing on, I guess, the other end? Like, what are some of the benefits if a producer decides to go down this route?
I think in general, just healthier calves, it's not going to get rid of all infections though, but the recovery of infections will be faster if the immune status of the calf is improved through feeding more colostrum. It looks like there's some developmental programming happening with respect to colostrum too. That's really been well characterized in other species like swine, especially. We're noting that that's probably happening in the calf too. It's very difficult to do this research to see how it programs this calf long term, but it looks like based on the research over the last 20 years, this is probably happening. So the way that we feed a calf, even in the first hours of life, can have a long-term impact.
Is the increase in the amount of colostrum that we want to do, is that because like genetically, like these animals are just higher performers, or is it maybe we have been underfeeding them the whole time and we're just catching up with the research now?
I think we're underfeeding them the entire time. And I'm just going to go back to some research that we did a couple years ago here at our research station, but I did it with the beef cows and just watching them suckle from their dams and looking at their IgG levels. Most of them were over 50 grams per liter. Our cutoff for dairy for a failed passive transfer of immunity is 10
Oh,
grams per liter in circulation. Then all these beef calves that were just suckling from their dam were over 50. And it just made me think, wow, maybe we're doing something wrong. And because they're clearly getting a lot of IgG mass if they're at 50, like in some of these cows were producing 500 to 1,000 grams of IgG in their colostrum. So they were being delivered that, and even the transition milk, like you do the calculation, you approximate the first 24 hours, they're actually receiving 500 to 1,000 grams of IgG in the beef system. So I think that, it's a lot more concentrated colostrum in the beef cow. That's why I'm saying, yeah, we should be feeding higher levels. 50 grams per liter of IgG is a typical metric we use for colostrum. Some people use 60. I would say let's use 70. Let's go
mhm.
even higher. Let's try to use the most concentrated colostrum source that we can use. Make sure that we feed adequate volumes.
Well, it's super interesting when you sit there and look at, well, this is what the beef cow does. And I know like anecdotally from industry, everybody complains, oh, these stupid heifer calves, like these whole scenes, they just don't want to live after you, like they get sick and then they just want to die. But the beef calf, you look at them, they're running around on pasture and much healthier. So I guess at the end of the day, is it just maybe the Holstein is a tougher animal than we think, but we're just not feeding it well enough to get it,
Yeah.
past some of those disease pressures.
Yeah, I have always thought that. I think it's the disease pressure that we put our dairy calves in,
Well, and
Keith.
that's the other thing too,
I
right?
think the environments like they're not on extensive pasture like in Western Canada. Like those are actually quite clean environments in a lot of cases compared to where a dairy calf would go. But it's interesting that a lot of people think that genetics plays a big role into it, and I've heard a lot about crossbred calves now, and they're healthier compared to a replacement heifer, and Holsteins are not as healthy as, let's say, a crossbred. But if you put that crossbred in the same kind of rearing system as we do with replacement animals or any kind of Holstein dairy beef, veal kind of operation, they're still going to get sick. And actually, we've been looking deeper into this data. It looks like, yes, the incidence of their sickness is really the same. So some people think that crossbreds, they're a lot healthier, but we still put them in this environment, this very, you know, pathogen-ridden environment where they're still going to get sick. The mortality might be a little bit less, but we still are having a lot of sick calves out there. And I think it has a lot to do with their environment, ventilation, as well as how clean their environment is. And of course, nutrition. I have to say nutrition because I'm a nutrition professor. It plays obviously a huge
Oh,
role,
it
but
it, it absolutely
you
does.
can't discount the environment. Is so huge with ventilation, especially with respiratory disease, like hitting alarming rates in our industry, and also like, just how clean the environment is.
Well, I think like you hit the nail on the head with air because a lot of it, or like ventilation, because I think a lot of it is we breathe so much air. Like if you look at how much feed they eat versus how much water they drink versus how much air they breathe, air by number one is like the biggest consumed product that a calf or anybody, anything throughout their life will consume. So if you've got dirty air, I think you're already behind the eight ball.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't know enough about ventilation, but I'm really fascinated by it because I think it's like a huge calf killer, actually, in a lot of environments. Just a poor ventilated barn, the calves are highly susceptible to getting ill, and like even from a gastrointestinal sort, I think it really compromises their immune system.
Yeah, and you hear these antiquated thoughts, I guess, from producers that, like you had mentioned with the crossbreds, like they still have the respiratory issues that the Holsteins do. And I always go back to, well, we put these crossbreds into an intensive growth program typically. Like with a traditional beef calf, it's going to be on pasture for the first 6, 7, 8 months of its life. And then with these crossbreds, we're not really treating them any different than we would a replacement heifer, right? Like they're staying on a relatively intensive feeding program, whether it be, the amount of milk or they're going right on starters and then they're going on growers. And it's like we're really kind of trying to accelerate their growth because we don't have the cow for them to suckle on, right?
Yeah, we're replacing grain or the milk that it would be receiving from the cow suckling with grain. And a lot of starch is what I'm seeing around here in Ontario is we're feeding a lot of starch. If you have access to byproducts, you want your animals to grow a little bit slower, but the cost per kilogram of gain is more economical sometimes with specific sources of byproducts. It could be a good idea to look into, perhaps having a slower growth rate. However, if you have a high starch diet, from birth all the way to the end of the feedlot, these animals can grow outrageously fast. Post weaning over 2 kg, and even in the feedlot over 2 kg. So that's alarmingly high rates. Of course, implants help.
Yeah.
Let's just be honest about that. But it begs the discussion, and this is something that our research program, what we want to really study by doing a lot of these experiments where we follow the animal from birth all the way to the abattoir. But does increasing this growth rate by, feeding higher energy diets, be it from fat or starch, is that more environmentally friendly if we can finish an animal? Because you can reach, finishing weights at around 12 months now if you really push their growth. So having a shorter lifespan, is that more environmentally friendly for for our industry? So that's the big debate. Or should we be slowing down this growth rate by feeding byproducts, which also has its own imprint on our environment? So I think, this is the future in this area, is to determine that balancing point of having, we know that we can achieve really high growth rates if we feed a lot of starch to these animals from start to finish.
Hmm.
Does that have any health issues? A lot of people talk about liver abscesses. We can talk about that later. I'm not really convinced on that one. Also the environmental imprint of this diet. And I think that we can make a case in the dairy world, or these crossbreds being produced from dairy farms, that we have a very environmentally friendly product because we don't have the cow calf herd, first of all. That's the biggest
Hmm.
one. But we can also use so many byproducts to raise these animals. And that's really, really special, that we can use these byproducts that otherwise could be wasted and actually produce a very healthy product with it. So I think that's what we'll be focusing on for the next 6 years, actually, is accumulating these data sets and doing a lot of the calculations with respect to carbon footprint, and in addition to the economics of it, and finding that balancing point. Because I think that this dairy beef, it's of course growing really rapidly, but I think it's a really good source of sustainable beef in the future.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you bring up with I guess, the sustainability issue. Because if you're looking at, replacing the cow calf herd with the dairy herd, it seems like these animals are always in a production cycle, where with the cow herd, like the beef cow herd, they're sitting idle a lot of the times a year, where they're just consuming food and growing a fetus and things like that. So yeah, that's really interesting.
They're the major source of greenhouse emissions from the beef industry. So to be able to bypass that I'm not saying, to replace the industry, that's not
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
feasible. We don't have the
No,
dairy
no, no,
cow
no,
population
no,
to do so.
no.
But I think it's a healthy alternative sometimes. And there's a lot of advantages, but I think we need to do a lot of work in that area of the dairy beef, especially in early life. That's where I see the major opportunities for improvement. There's only so much you can do with a feedlot diet. But before that, you have transport, you have antimicrobial use, you have calves getting sick all the time, just even if they're crossbred. So I think that we should be addressing that. I'm pretty sure that that probably has a long-term impact on that animal and how they perform in feedlot. And I think that we can probably improve animal welfare, first of all, but also production efficiency by digging deeper in that area.
I kind of want to circle back to transition milk. I know you kind of briefly touched on
Mhm.
it, but is there anything that producers can do? Like, a lot of times it gets discarded, and I know your lab's done a lot of work on uses for some of that stuff. Like, what are some of the benefits of keeping that transition milk around and feeding it to calves?
Yeah, there's so many transitions in the dairy cow's life, but we always talk about the transition cow. We always talk about weaning, but I do think that there is this transition from colostrum to milk that we need to pay attention to. There's only been benefits recorded through feeding transition milk. So even the milk from the cow, and just for definition reasons, transition milk is milking two, three, four, five, and six is how it's typically defined in the literature. So it's still full of a lot of bioactives, a lot of hormones, really healthy carbohydrates like prebiotics, different fatty acid profiles. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity for us to feed it more. So either from the cow, but if it's not manageable on a farm, you could supplement it. So you could actually supplement colostrum with whole milk to provide some form of transition from colostrum to a whole milk or a milk replacer. But I think providing this transition for the first 2 to 3 days is a really good approach. Another approach is to feed colostrum at a very low percentage, around 10%, for the first week or two of life if a farm is struggling with diarrhea. So that's another
Hmm.
approach that some farms have had some success with. It is costly. It depends on your colostrum source, but diarrhea is also costly too. So it's a
Hmm.
cost benefit analysis that the farmer needs to do, but it's been shown to improve health and the resolution of diarrhea by the supplementation of colostrum.
And like, from your perspective, what is it about the transition milk that's so helpful with some of these disease pressures?
I think first of all, you don't have this abruptness of a switch in nutrient content from the first meals of life all the way. Like sometimes we're switching from colostrum to a milk or a milk replacer in the first day of life abruptly. And that's a big shift in what the gut has to deal with. And also delivering some of this transition milk, it's full of bioactives that can also help with gut health, but overall health as well. It's been shown that these bioactives have many different, endpoints in the calf where it will improve health. And I don't really know where I'm going with this, Keith. Sorry.
No, but like
We can
there
cut
is
this out.
like there's I cut nothing out. But
Good.
there is a lot of like I think like and I learned this from you is that there's a lot of bioactives that we don't know anything about in the milk and
That's the
maybe don't know
thing.
what they do.
Yeah, so let's just focus on the one that we know the most about for IgG. There's still a little bit of IgG in transition milk. So what's interesting about this is that, even if the gut is closed, if they're still receiving this transition milk, this can probably be very helpful for this calf. So it can bind pathogens. It could probably reduce the amount of IgG from circulation that goes back to the gut. So they'll have more IgG in their circulation. But these other bioactives, it's true, we really don't know enough about it. I'll give you an example. We did a study actually at Lois Summit Home about 3 or 4 years ago where we were looking at colostrum insulin. So insulin's very high in colostrum, and we are trying to figure out why. So like, why does this cow have this? Is it just by chance? So we were trying to figure out why. And what we've realized is that, yeah, it does affect some of the enzymes in the intestine of the calf. It does affect actual villi growth as well. So it's a growth promotant of the gut. But, even after investing so much time, about 3 to 4 years, we really don't know a lot about insulin. Like,
Yeah,
so I came to the realization, even these bioactives, which there's hundreds of them in colostrum, we have to devote about 20 years of effort to really figure out what each one does. And we're still figuring out, what immune globulins do, how they work, how they're absorbed. We actually don't even know how they're absorbed in a calf. There's still a lot of
really.
debate about that. Yeah,
Yeah.
isn't that funny that
Yeah.
and
And
also
it's
how
something
the
we've
gut,
talked about for 20 years, right? Or more.
yeah,
Yeah.
and like even the way that we look at it, apparent efficiency of absorption is the way it's called AEA. So we take a blood sample from a calf and we assume that that's where all the IgG is. It's not. The IgG goes everywhere in the calf's body. So there's still like so much to do in colostrum, which makes it really exciting. A really very, very exciting topic for research. Really
Well,
glad I'm doing it.
it's one of the things that from what I see is that it is probably the most critical thing to a calf's life and it's the least understood.
I would say that too. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like we don't even know how it's synthesized, actually. That's really interesting too. So we're spending a
Well,
lot of time in that area because
that
I get that question all the time. I don't have enough colostrum. What do I do? And I
it's
really hate saying, and I do it all the time. Like we don't really know. We
yeah,
know that overfeeding energy looks like it can decrease overall colostrogenesis. But maybe feeding other components that looks like protein uh, elevating protein, it might in some parodies increase the amount, but not in every single study. It makes it very challenging to give these recommendations, especially from a nutritional standpoint, to how to increase colostrum synthesis in a cow. Like it's very challenging. So
well,
we've been
I,
doing a lot of work in that area, mainly from a basic standpoint of trying to figure out when does colostrogenesis occur, how does it work? So we're just focused on that now, and we've been looking at some dietary interventions with energy, but I think it's a really exciting area that I want to spend a lot of time on in the future.
I know that's been one of the most frustrating things for me because I get the question from producers all the time. I don't have any colostrum. And it's
Mhm.
like, well, nobody has any answers about it. And I want to help. And so we end up trying things and you'll throw a little bit more grain or some more protein or something at them. And it's like the old Anchorman thing, 60% of the time it works every time. Like you never get a consistent result out of it, which is really frustrating to me because it just means that we don't know.
Yeah,
We're
it's
just
really
throwing stuff at the wall and hoping something sticks, right?
Yeah, and depending on when you throw it, the seasonality looks like it has a pretty large impact in the overall amount of colostrum being synthesized. But again,
Yeah.
also in the literature, that's also contradictory. Like at different points of the year, sometimes in studies, it's different, depending on
Well,
where you are, even in the northern hemisphere. Like it's very different. So yeah, that's why we had to take a step back and we wanted to look more so at what are what are the mechanisms of colostrogenesis? When is this occurring? Is it occurring the last 5 days before parturition? Is it occurring? What we've been finding out is that it's probably happening weeks in advance.
mhm.
And so we've been taking a lot of secretions from cows during the prepartum period, and the highest levels are at -2, -1 week before parturition when you look at colostrum IgG secretions or the secretions, the prepartum secretions.
Yeah.
So it's really, really concentrated even a week in advance before the cow actually, expands its udder size and starts to fill the other components of colostrum.
Well, and that's one of those things that I look at in industry and I would say, I know within my own herds, like the average length of gestation is actually kind of shortened up a bit. So are we
Mhm.
affecting colostrum yield by that because we're just calving cow, like a cow's metabolically for 282 days or whatever, and we're seeing lots of herd averages around 277, 275 days of gestation. Like, does that have an
Mhm.
effect on it, or is the cow just gonna automatically, she knows inherently that when she's going to calve, so does she gear her colostrum genesis towards that end date?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we have some data that it looks like it supports. It's quite preliminary, but it got us thinking about this topic a lot that cows that shut down their mammary gland right at dry off, they tend to produce more milk based on some preliminary, very preliminary data. It just got us thinking about this. So you need to get this mammary gland to go quiescent. And I think that's a really important part. You need to shut down completely. It looks like that's a very important part of the lactation process and gearing up this animal for the next lactation. So I think like we could actually be impacting clostrogenesis weeks in advance.
Like when you're drying your cow off?
Maybe even when you're drying your cow off, you could, and there's a lot of people talking about this now where, the way that you dry off a cow can affect even lactation. And I think that this is very interesting. I also think it could possibly affect clostrogenesis. Now, there's got to be a lot more studies related to that. But the point I want to make is I don't think clostrogenesis is occurring the days before lactation. I think it's occurring weeks. And I think the way that we manage animals and feed them in, even 2 months before parturition can actually have an impact on clostrogenesis. So we look forward to like finalizing some of this data this year and actually submitting it to journals like the Journal of Dairy Science and getting it peer
Mhm.
reviewed. But it's pretty exciting to kind of look into these new areas where we don't really understand it. Like, and I think colostrum has so many of these open pages that haven't been filled out with respect to colostrogenesis, and then also how, like as we were discussing before, how IgG is taken up by a calf. Like very basic things that we really don't understand.
It's not like you can go inside of a calf and see the exact mode of action or the direct pathway on how it's done, right? Like we look at the outside of the calf, we have no idea. Well, we have some idea what's going on inside the calf, but there's a lot of things that are still just not quite understood.
Yeah, there's lots
Yeah.
of research groups that are looking inside, and we can study what genes are being up and down regulated. We do that in our lab too, and that gives us some insight of these mechanisms, but obviously very difficult to collect some of these samples.
A lot of producers too, I talk to about and how transition is such a dirty word around the farm. And it seems like we've had a lot of focus on transitioning cows from milk to diets like dry feeds or like post weaning diets. Is there any changes that you've seen in the last little bit that are really benefiting producers in those programs?
From weeding strategies with calves, I
Yeah,
would
yeah,
say
like from weaning and getting them weaned and move group moves and things like that, right?
I think the biggest development over the last 10 years has been group housing and paired housing. I think that work out of UBC that's really affected our pro action and the way that we raise animals was It's pretty significant because, of course, if you pair, you have group housing, the animals are going to learn from each other and eat starter at greater amounts earlier in life, and that will improve weaning. But then there's also the weaning principles of weaning later is always better. I think weaning
Hmm.
age is probably the biggest contributor to weaning success. So after 8 weeks for sure, longer is always better. I just came back from living in Europe for a year, and a lot of people are weaning at 12 weeks. You don't really see that here in North America, but I think definitely not under 8 weeks. Having a gradual step down, minimum 2 weeks, multiple steps too. I'm a little bit concerned about just one step now, based on some of our studies. I think multiple steps, if you can do it, is far better. And now we're kind of open up an area in our lab, trying to figure out how the milk feeding scheme and even the composition should be related to the composition of the starter. So I find this area kind of interesting because I think calves can perform differently on the same starter based on how you feed the milk. And we've been trying to nail down that concept. But I think there's a lot to that because I think that calves that are fed higher levels of milk shouldn't be fed really high levels of starch in their starters. Now, most starters are around 30% starch, which is really high compared to a lactating cow ration, but some of them are around 50% starch in the marketplace. So there's this huge difference here. And a lot of the times, those high starch diets, it's coming along with a low prescription of milk as
Hmm.
well. So I think that this concept is alive, and I think that eventually we'll be trying to figure out more and more of that. But another key component too is you have to feed concentrate ad libitum, especially during this post-weaning period. I think only feeding small amounts of this dry feed or a concentrate grower limited can really have a large impact because we underestimate how much concentrate they can consume at this age. They can consume up to 3.5% of their body weight post weaning, and their conversion levels into gain is really, really high. We can say it's because of rumen fill, but it's not all rumen fill. The rumen only contributes a little bit to it. They can have really high average daily gains of above 1.5 kg, even at 2 to 3 months of age.
Hmm.
So I think that there's a lot to that with not overfeeding NDF and forage during this time because we do have this unnatural system here where we weaning them all early, even if it's at 8 weeks or 12 weeks. It's earlier than 6 to 8 months, like what would happen in nature. So we still have to compensate for that lack of energy, and that's why we're feeding higher concentrate diets. They're not ready to digest forages and ADF, especially during this time. So I think we need to be very careful with how much forage we're feeding, at least for the months post weaning.
You kind of see it. Like I know the industry's kind of gone to feeding low inclusions of straw. It's kind of interesting to look at because I've got herds that mix it in a TMR, and then I've got herds that do it where they'll just feed a grower and then they'll feed like ad libitum straw. And it's kind of funny because if you watch the calves, some calves will eat it quite a bit of it, and other calves just kind of nose through it and pick away at it. But the growth seems to be really good on it. So,
Mhm. I think, there's not a lot of differences between an ad libitum concentrate with the forage on the side compared to a total mixed ration with a lower amount of forage in the concentrate. And typically it's around 15% of a chopped straw that's mixed with this concentrate, plus or minus 5% at this stage post weaning, which appears to be working quite well. But yeah, I agree. I think it's a really good way of feeding animals, and I really don't think that there's a big difference between the TMR and the ad lib, other than the ad lib will probably consume more concentrate compared to
mhm.
forage, compared to the TMR. But in the grand scheme of things, it's really not that big of a difference. And calves can, mediate their ruminal acidosis probably by, free access to a forage can probably take care of that if they're having a bellyache with the high starch diets that they're typically consuming at that time.
And when you're feeding some of these straw and high concentrate diets to these animals, like how important is water? To me, like it seems like that's the key is that when these animals go to these high concentrate and low forage diets, I think and I don't know, I don't have any numbers to back this up, but I think their water consumption goes through the roof. and that kind of
Yeah,
drives intakes and makes the whole thing go.
yeah, I think obviously access to clean water is really critical, but where it becomes really critical, in my opinion, is during the weeding process because they can go from a liter to 12 liters in a couple days with respect to consumption. And, it's pretty cold out here right now. And I'm not sure if there's a lot of calves and hutches out there right now having free access to water right now 24/7. And I think that's really critical because water intake is related to starter intake.
Mhm.
So if you decrease the water intake, you're going to decrease the starter intake. If you decrease the starter intake, most likely going to increase the water intake. They're totally
Yeah.
related. So I think that offering fresh water is really critical, making sure that it's clean. Then we haven't even talked about composition of water. And, even the composition of water that's mixed with a milk replacer. I think that these
Mhm.
areas are totally wide open and we need to study more. But yeah, obviously water intake is so critical and totally understudied,
Yeah.
especially in the calf world.
If you start kind of Googling like water consumption, like it's like, okay, well, cow's going to drink between 100 and 150 liters a day, but that's usually where it ends. Like there doesn't seem to be a lot of interest or work, or maybe it's not sexy. I don't know, but like just to me, it seems like the farms that do well have more water available. But is that because they're better managers? So they see something like that, so they add that in, or I think it
Yeah,
comes down to like a chicken or an egg
it's true. There
scenario, right?
haven't been a lot of people that have focused their career on water nutrition in the dairy world. There's Dr. Bede from Michigan State University and Dr. Vern Osborne here at the University of Guelph. And I think that they came up with a lot of really great ideas on water composition, but also how to feed water and also using water as a vehicle for nutrients too. That's been untapped, absolutely. Like you can mix different amino acids or fatty acids or glucose with water, and it could be a means of nutrient delivery. But it's, obviously not really happening in the dairy world. It happens all the time in other species, though in
Yeah.
other livestock sectors, but you don't really see that in the dairy world. So that's totally untapped. But I think that, the way that we set up our barns has changed quite a bit with our water feeders. I think we're allowing enough space now. Back 20 years ago, I remember seeing alleyways with water feeders in it, and the cows can't even drink because there's so much traffic. And that's been taken care of, I've noticed over the last 20 years. And I think, we're putting more water troughs in and different sources of water. Sometimes you'll even see, different water feeders within the same freestall pen too,
Hmm.
just trying to maximize the amount and access to water. So I think that that's a big component in keeping everything clean, but totally understudied and probably lots of opportunity for untapped potential there.
To kind of look back here too, like you kind of mentioned, like maybe a higher protein starter with higher levels of milk. Like, does that change if you're doing whole milk versus replacer?
So the protein level, I'm not really sure of, but I was thinking like on a higher milk, I think possibly a lower starch might be
Well,
better.
well, I'm just
But
looking like if typically if you're lower starch, you'll be higher protein, right?
typically the starch would be substituted with probably a non-forage fiber substitute like a bee pulp or a
Oh,
soy
okay.
hulls.
Okay. Yep.
So the protein would be very similar, I would say. So it's starch in place of NDF. You raise a really good point with protein, and there's a lot of people talking differently about protein right now. It really gets me going, and it makes me want to do more protein work in the future. Because at this point, I don't think we really understand microbial protein synthesis in the rumen of the developing ruminant. And until we start calculating when microbial protein synthesis is occurring, because if you add more starch, you're most likely going to have more microbial protein synthesis compared to adding more protein. It's not just adding protein, it's the energy is really the key part of producing the microbial protein.
So is that
So
just through creating butyrate or?
so what's the energy is actually being all the different end products can be used by the microbes to grow. So in
Mhm.
order, just think about this ruminant as a microbial fermentation vat. And you can't just put protein in that vat. You need, protein's obviously very important, but you need that energy. The energy is really driving the fermentated process. So I think that's the most critical part. And it's not necessarily butyrate, it's just more energy for the microbes, and you have more microbes being produced in that rumen per day, and they're going to go to the abomasum. Most of them are going to die, and then they're going to be a really rich source of protein. Around 50% protein is what
Mhm.
microbes are. So that's I think we don't know enough about that right now to really say, and I know a lot of people are saying this, that we should be feeding a lot more protein during this transition period. This could be true. So you see these really high protein diets of 26, 28% coming out in the marketplace. And I'm not so necessarily convinced of that until we learn more about microbial protein synthesis and when that's occurring. I'm thinking of doing more research, doing some research in that area in the future.
It's interesting. It's like the old adage, like the more you learn, the less you know. Like you
Yeah.
realize the less
It's
you
the best
know.
part of my job. So I don't like being bored in my life. So this is the perfect job for me because
Yeah.
every experiment leads to 10 more. So no
Yeah.
problem.
You're good at creating your work.
Yes, I've become really good at that, according to my wife. So yes, I'm glad that you validated that.
Yeah. There's been a bit of talk in the industry of tripling birth weight by 70 days. Is
Yeah,
that something that is a goal to that producers should be looking at, or are we still pretty early stages on that? Like, can you grow a calf too fast?
that's a really good question. I think that when you look at Mother Nature, that's typically what's happening is a tripling. So when I say, are we growing them too fast in artificial rearing systems? I can't say for sure, but I don't see a problem with accelerating growth in early life. I actually have yet to see any kind of disadvantage to accelerating growth in early life of this dairy animal. So I do think tripling, which is occurring on many farms, is a pretty good target. I know Jersey's always talk about it. Jersey producers always talk about it.
Mhm.
Uh, but I do think it's possible with a Holstein to do that. You know, obviously, I think it's a good indication that they're not having this dip in their overall, like during the weaning period up to day 70. I'm assuming they're going to be reading around 10 weeks there, but also during the diarrhea and respiratory struggles that are happening, diarrhea between 7 and 21 days, respiratory. I've noticed on some farms is even starting earlier than 1 month. And
Mhm.
you see, that's a huge decline in overall growth. So I think when you see this tripling, those are farms that are not struggling with a lot of health issues. And that's how they can really achieve that. And they're also feeding more milk and they have really good weaning protocols too. So I've seen that a lot in the industry, and I do think it is, something people can strive for. I think doubling, people are getting really good at that in Canada, but tripling is probably the next step. Now I'm going to open up a big can of worms here, Keith, but yeah, I think average daily
Yep.
gain is obviously really important. I don't want to confuse your audience, but I also think the composition of gain should also be thought about.
Yeah.
I think that we talk about lean growth all the time, and let's get these animals not over conditioned, not fat. But I'm not really convinced on that too. So that's another area that we're kind of tapping into. I don't have any suggestions to any of your audience on what this means, but I am thinking more and more about the composition of growth and what exactly does, a high average daily gain, if it's lean muscle mass growth, maybe that affects the metabolism of the animal later on in life rather than a high average daily gain where there's a lot of adipose.
Mhm.
Adipose is an organ. There's lots of importance to this organ of the adipose fat cells produce a lot of hormones, a lot of inflammatory markers as well. There's some definite modulation of the physiology of the calf through this. And when I think about like my kids, of course, in the first 6 months they were quite chunky,
Oh
and
yeah. Yeah.
the doctors
Little
promote that.
butterballs.
The pediatricians, think that's a great thing. And I think about in the calf world, we don't like that. And if I told a pediatrician, yeah, I want my child to grow lean between 0 and 6 months of life, I would be put in jail. So
Yeah.
So let's just think about this a little bit more. And this is the beauty about calf research is that you can rethink everything now because I think we need to refresh some of this stuff. I think we are dealing with totally different growth rates compared to 20, 30 years ago, where a lot of this fundamental calf research being very good, like the foundation of calf research coming from like Jim Quigley's and James Drakely's and just amazing researchers that laid down this foundation. But there were different genetics and there were different feeding rates at this time and different growth expectations. Now we're updating that. James did an awesome job updating the recent NASM.
Mhm.
But we're moving in this direction. I think that we need to update our models to our that we're using for ration balancing to really account for these higher growth rates.
Well, I'm kind of glad you brought that up because it's never, I don't think, a bad thing to see these chunky little animals up to, maybe 6 months of age and then maybe start to lean out a little bit more. Because one thing that I am noticing in industry is that our growth targets have changed on calves, but our breeding targets, I think producers still look at months of age when they start breeding.
Yeah.
And I kind of wonder if some of our heifer repro issues aren't because they are too fat at that age. Like we have them on these highly accelerated growth programs, then all of a sudden, if they're not pregnant by 12, 13 months old, you're not catching them until they're 14, 15 months old. Are they just getting too chunky on you and you're just having some repro issues on that end? So,
Yeah, I think the key point of time is around puberty to really control the energy,
mhm.
which can happen really early, actually. We did this one study where we were feeding high milk, high concentrate, and we had some calves actually achieve sexual maturity or puberty before 6 months of age. And actually,
Really?
yeah, and you can see LH surges too, even at 3 months of age if you have animals growing over a kilo a day.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that high energy is actually, I think that's actually good to have some LH surges and, develop the reproductive tract so that it can go through more cycles during this time. But the concern is always, especially around puberty, how this will affect reproduction. So I think, dialing down the energy probably 2 months after weaning, so around that 4 to 5 month mark, might be a good idea. So not leaving them on ad lib high concentrate diets until 6 months or 12 months of age, but
Yeah.
dialing it down and increasing the NDF, I think could be a better thing to do. There's also the concern about mammary gland development. I'm not really convinced on a lot of this data showing, especially, feeding higher levels of milk or even higher growth rates can decrease mammary gland development. I think it's really interesting data. I think it's a little bit outdated now. And I don't think we really have nailed down that concept that overconditioned animals decrease overall mammary gland development. I know there's some good studies published in that area, but I think they're old and I don't think that they're totally related because it's impossible to really know how mammary gland development in early life is related to future production.
Hmm.
Not unless you're ultrasounding the mammary gland. I think that's probably the best way of doing that. But it's
Yeah.
very difficult to study and track mammary gland development and how diet and overconditioning can actually impact future production.
Well, what they had looked at that, like, especially with the over conditioning thing, and then you get some udder edema and things like that, and they just don't produce as well in their first lactation, and maybe they tied those two together.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, definitely overconditioning in late gestation is a huge issue. But thankfully we're taking care of that in our industry with the high forage, high straw diets.
Was there anything else that you are working on here that you kind of wanted to share with producers that they can maybe practically implement on farm today?
Yeah, I guess if I could summarize some of the messages is really think more about your colostrum feeding strategies and increasing the quality of your colostrum and going up to these higher volume feeding rates. I'm not talking like more than 3 or 4 liters in the first meal, but make sure that you're delivering hundreds of grams, if not like 300 grams of IgG, I think is a good target. And even in that second meal, it can be a lower volume, of course. It's typically fed around 5% of birth body weight, and make sure that that's a really high quality meal and follow that with a transition milk feeding program. either from the cow itself, or you can mix different colostrum sources, dry or fresh, with milk, and it's got to be consistent. It's a little bit easier with dried because with liquid, you have to test it all the time.
Hmm.
Um, but I think having this transition from colostrum to a milk or a milk replacer is really important to consider. And growth is really important as we're talking. I think feeding higher rates of milk is something that we're doing really well in Canada compared to everywhere else in the world. And I think we're seeing the benefits of that. But feeding high levels of milk isn't everything. I think, going back to some of our earlier conversations in this podcast, is the environment that we're putting our animals in is so critical. You're seeing a lot more development in that area. And, those barns that were built 20, 30 years ago, or that were just like terrible from a ventilation standpoint. I think we're getting a lot better in that area, and we're giving them more space, and we're moving to more group housing and automated feeding. And I actually think even giving them more space is probably like more critical in those scenarios when they're in group housing. So I
Hmm.
think we're learning more and more in that area. I think weaning, as we were mentioning, wean late, don't wean abruptly, wean with multiple steps. So when I say late, definitely after 8 weeks, even push it to 10 weeks if you can, I think, and make sure that you're not overfeeding forage immediately post weaning. The calf's rumen is very small at that time, and if you fill it full of forage, they're just not going to eat and pass that feed to the lower gut, and that's going to overall decrease their overall average daily gain. I guess like finally, we've done a lot of work looking at antimicrobials, and we're not really convinced on the prophylactic use of antimicrobials that's commonly done in our industry, especially with calf rears. I think that we need to rethink this based on some of our recent research. And I think a lot more people are moving to therapeutic use, which I think will decrease our daily defined dose of these antimicrobials quite a bit. And I think there's some microbial solutions out there. So when I say microbial based solutions, I mean probiotics or prebiotics that can help. And we've done a lot of research in that area. But I will caution, not every probiotic is the same. They're just like people, okay? We're all different. So you got to be very careful when you're moving into these microbial-based solutions. It's not a silver bullet at all. I think it's not going to work in every single environment, but make sure that you're using well-published technologies that have went through peer review in really high-ranking journals like Journal of Dairy Science, like at
Hmm.
least 3 publications showing efficacy, or else I wouldn't really touch the probiotic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's about what we're studying in addition to our dairy beef program, which is really the majority of our work right now with respect to research.
We're on a bit of a time constraint, so I would have really loved to get into that. I guess we'll have to sit down and do this again and talk a bit more of that, because that is a pretty fast-paced and growing industry right now.
Yeah, you bet. I'm really excited about all the research that we're doing in that area. So yeah, I'd
Yeah.
love to talk about it in the future. And these are really long studies. A lot of these studies take 2 to 3 years to do. So
Yeah.
we should book in advance, and hopefully we can update you
I'll book you
with
back in for 27.
2027. I
Yeah.
should be finished the second study at that time. But like kudos to I just
Yeah.
want to like a shout out to my grad students who are doing these
Yeah.
studies. They work so hard, and without them, I can't report any of this. But especially these dairy beef studies, from start to finish, they're 2 years, and
Yeah.
that's with slaughtering them at 12 to 13 months. So yeah, it's really incredible to work with awesome students to make this research turn into reality.
Well, Mike, I appreciate you coming on the podcast again. You were the first guest that I had on that I did a solo interview on.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, so that was I think in 2020 when we did that. So
Oh, wow. Cool.
yeah, no, I truly appreciate your time, and I've been following a lot of the work that you've done over your career, and had the ability to work with you for a little bit as well too,
That was
and
fun.
that was great. So no,
Yeah.
I truly appreciate it. Thank you.
Great, Keith. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. This episode of the Dairy Farmers Digest is brought to you by the dairy team at Wallenstein Feed and Supply Limited. If you enjoy the show, subscribe and follow us on your favorite podcast player, and please leave us a review. If you would like further information about today's topic, check out the show notes for further details and our contact information. I would also like to extend a special thanks to Christine Schoonerwood, our producer, and our sound engineer, Daniel Noguera.